In 1940, the British Expeditionary Force and large numbers of French and Belgian troops were driven backward by one of the most devastating military offensives in modern history. German armour had cut through the Ardennes, reached the Channel, and trapped the Allied armies against the sea in northern France. By late May, Dunkirk was the last usable port left to them. Behind the soldiers came German guns, tanks, and aircraft. In front of them lay only water. What followed was not a victory in the usual sense. It was an escape under fire, a retreat turned into legend, and one of the defining episodes of the Second World War. Dunkirk. The disaster at Dunkirk began with the speed of the German campaign in the west. While French and British commanders moved north into Belgium, expecting the main blow there, the decisive German thrust came through the Ardennes. Tanks and mechanized columns smashed across the Meuse and surged toward the Channel, splitting the Allied front and cutting off the forces in Belgium and northern France. Within days, what had begun as a campaign became a trap. The British Army started thinking about evacuation before most others because it could see that the road south was closing fast. The evacuation received the code name Operation Dynamo. It was organized by the Royal Navy and coordinated by Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay from deep inside the tunnels beneath Dover Castle. English heritage describes those tunnels as the nerve center of the rescue. From there, Ramsay and a small staff attempted something that at first seemed almost impossible: pull a surrounded army across the Channel before it was destroyed or captured. The original plan was modest and bleak. The expectation was to rescue perhaps 30,000 to 45,000 men in only 2 days. No one imagined that Operation Dynamo would become the largest evacuation in military history. As German forces captured or threatened the Channel ports one by one, Dunkirk became the last narrow doorway out. But even that doorway was damaged. The harbour had been bombed. The town burned. Refugees, vehicles, abandoned equipment, and retreating soldiers jammed the approaches. IWM notes that by May 26 Dunkirk was the final port remaining, and that its condition led to grim predictions about how many men could actually be saved. Yet the evacuation had to begin anyway, because every hour lost meant the ring around the coast tightening further. Operation Dynamo officially began on May 26, 1940. The first full day showed how difficult the task would be. Britannica's timeline records that on May 27 only 7,669 troops were rescued. That was a start, but nowhere near enough to save the mass of men waiting on the beaches and around the harbour. The Luftwaffe attacked the port. Ships were threatened. The sea crossing itself was dangerous. If the rescue had continued at that pace, Dunkirk would be remembered not as a miracle, but as a catastrophe only partially relieved. Dunkirk could only be evacuated because other men were fighting to hold the shrinking perimeter. The British at Calais resisted desperately. French forces at Lille tied down major German strength. IWM notes that the defenders at Calais held until May 26, while French troops at Lille occupied 10 German divisions. Those actions bought time for the Beaches and Mole at Dunkirk. The soldiers boarding boats owed their survival to soldiers elsewhere who understood they were unlikely to escape at all. Dunkirk was not just a naval story. It was also a story of sacrifice on land. One of the most debated moments in the campaign came before the evacuation was fully underway: the German halt order of May 24. IWM explains that parts of the German High Command feared the fast-moving armoured spearheads were overextended and vulnerable to counterattack. There was also confidence that the Luftwaffe could finish the trapped Allied troops from the air. Whatever the mix of reasons, the pause gave the Allies precious time to organize defences around Dunkirk. It did not save them by itself, but it created the breathing space without which Operation Dynamo might have failed before it began. The evacuation also benefited from chance. According to IWM, the weather was unusually favorable for much of the operation. Light winds reduced the surf, making it easier for men to be taken off the beaches in small boats. Low cloud and smoke drifting from the burning port gave some concealment from air attack. The famous phrase, "the miracle of Dunkirk," partly comes from this sense that nature itself seemed, for a few days, to cooperate with survival. Calm seas and obscuring smoke did not end the danger, but they tilted the odds just enough to matter. Popular memory often focuses on the beaches, but much of the evacuation happened from the East Mole, a long harbour breakwater never intended for mass embarkation. IWM stresses that this improvised pier became the key to the entire rescue. English Heritage gives the scale. 239,465 troops were taken off via the Mole, while 98,761 were rescued from the beaches. The Mole allowed men to step directly onto destroyers and larger vessels, avoiding the slower process of ferrying every soldier from shallow water. It was a piece of maritime improvisation that helped turn a doomed retreat into a functioning rescue system. Then there were the little ships. Hundreds of civilian craft, lifeboats, fishing boats, yachts, barges, and pleasure steamers answered the call. Britannica's timeline estimates that around 1,000 vessels took part overall, including roughly 700 civilian craft. English Heritage notes that by May 31 hundreds of civilian vessels had joined the operation. Some crossed the channel themselves. Others ferried troops from the beaches out to larger ships waiting offshore. Their role became the emotional center of the Dunkirk story, ordinary people sailing into danger to help save an army. The legend is real, even if the full story is more complex than patriotic memory often suggests. For the men on the sand, Dunkirk was often less a battle than an ordeal of waiting. Accounts described scenes that swung between exhaustion, discipline, panic, and boredom. Soldiers stood in long queues in the shallows, were strafed and bombed from the air, and watched ships burn offshore. IWM notes that some remembered near chaos, every man for himself getting loaded, while others described grim patience. Dunkirk's emotional power comes from that image, not triumphant attack, but armed men reduced to endurance, hoping a boat would come before the next wave of bombs. The Luftwaffe never stopped trying to turn Dunkirk into a killing ground. Britannica records that on June 1, clear weather gave the German Air Force one of its biggest opportunities, and that day 4 destroyers and 27 other vessels were sunk. Over the full evacuation, about 240 vessels were lost and another 45 damaged. Yet even under this pounding, ships kept coming. The evacuating fleet was battered, but not broken. Dunkirk was a race between the speed of loading and the speed of destruction. Many soldiers on the beaches felt abandoned by the Royal Air Force because they could not always see British fighters overhead. But the RAF was fighting further inland and above the cloud, trying to contest German air superiority and protect the evacuation routes. Britannica's timeline records RAF losses of 84 aircraft against 78 for the Luftwaffe during the operation. The air battle around Dunkirk became part of the later debate over what really happened there. The men on the sand remembered terror from above, while the airmen remembered a costly effort that made the rescue possible even when it went largely unseen. Then came the extraordinary acceleration. Britannica's day-by-day totals show the operation gathering pace. 17,804 rescued on 28 May, 47,310 on 29 May, 53,823 on May 30th, and then 68,014 on May 31st, the biggest single day of the evacuation. Bad weather sometimes interfered with German attacks. Procedures improved. The Mole was exploited fully. More vessels joined the effort. Operation Dynamo transformed from a partial rescue into a mass extraction. Each day's figures showed that the impossible was becoming real. When men were rescued from Dunkirk, almost everything else had to be left behind. Guns, trucks, ammunition, fuel, and transport were abandoned or destroyed. IWM notes that Britain was left effectively open to invasion in material terms, even if its army had been saved in manpower. This is why Churchill warned that wars are not won by evacuations. Dunkirk was a deliverance, but also a confession of military defeat in France. The miracle saved trained soldiers. It did not save the campaign. By the end of the operation on June 4, 1940, 338,226 Allied troops had been evacuated. Britannica summarizes that roughly 198,000 were British and 140,000 were French and Belgian. What had been planned as a 2-day effort to rescue perhaps 45,000 men had become a 9-day operation that saved more than 7 times that number. The scale alone explains why Dunkirk entered history so quickly. This was not merely an escape. It was the preservation of Britain's field army at the moment of apparent ruin. Dunkirk quickly became something larger than an operation. It became a national story. British morale in 1940 needed light in the darkness, and Dunkirk provided it. IWM notes that the press and BBC emphasized heroism, resilience, and the famous little ships, helping create what later generations called the Dunkirk spirit. Yet the myth was built on a paradox. Dunkirk was a great success born from a great failure. It preserved the army and public morale, but France was still collapsing and Britain still faced the Battle of Britain alone. The legend was useful because it turned survival into purpose. Dunkirk endures because it holds together all the contradictions of war: defeat and salvation, improvisation and discipline, terror and endurance, luck and leadership. It was made possible by rearguards on the perimeter, officers in tunnels under Dover, destroyer crews at sea, civilians in small boats, and soldiers who waited on the beaches under fire. It did not win the Second World War, but it saved the core of an army that would fight on. In that sense, the miracle of Dunkirk was not the end of a campaign. It was the preservation of a future.